if the Cold War had gotten hot and the US lost? Welcome to my book review of Not This August, the 1955 Hugo Award finalist by CM Kornbluth. First of all, though, if you are new here, I post new book reviews almost every single day, so if you want to wake up to a new book review every single day, feel free to stick around. So today I'm going to be reviewing, as mentioned before, the 1955 finalist for the Hugo Award, Not This August by CM Kornbluth. I did read this uninspiring version with a plain yellow cover, just one of these regular boring old books. So to spice it up, when I'm holding the book up, I am holding up the ebook copy just to keep it interesting. The plot of Not This August is, just as mentioned, the Cold War has gotten hot. The Soviet Union and China have teamed up, and it has led to a land invasion in the United States. And the United States winds up losing this land invasion, and the China and USSR forces divide the United States, and the United States no longer exists. The landmass that used to be the United States now belongs to the USSR and China. The focus of this book switches from this macroscopic view of what's going on really quickly to the microscopic view of one farmer named Billy Justin. Billy Justin became a farmer to avoid conscription during the land invasion, during the war that just happened, the Cold War that went from cold to hot, and he is now having to adjust to life under this new regime. He is having to adjust to a life that is imposed upon him by his conquerors, the Soviet Union, and he is having to agree to their life. He's having to get used to quotas and how things are going to operate, things he can and can't say, and deferring to soldiers who now run the town that he is in. Things are moving along, and Billy Justin is just thinking, well, this is the way life is now, but I'm going to have to get used to it. And at the very beginning, it doesn't seem so bad, but everything kind of starts to turn when he agrees to take on a farmhand. It's one of his contacts, his friends in town, says there's a man who was saying some weird things and he needs to be discharged from the hospital to a caring person. Do you want a farmhand? I can get you a person. Billy Justin says yes, and he becomes the employer of sorts to Gribble. Gribble is a kind of interesting man. He's definitely not fully mentally with it, but he seems to be conveying a lot of important military secrets. So he is someone who used to be someone, and someone who is of course now wanted by the Soviet Union because they do not want anyone living who has contacts from the previous US government. And Justin realizes that he may be in over his head. He maybe realizes that there are military secrets that he and very few other people are now privy to, and the US's defeat is maybe not as final as it could be. There might be something he can still do. However, around him, this new world is getting tighter. The more lax first introduction of USSR, Soviet Union, rule is getting tighter and tighter, quotas are going up, and restrictions are getting tighter, controls are getting tighter. So Justin is trying to find a way to get word out and maybe recruit some people, as well as find contacts with the remnants of the US government to see what he can do to drive the Soviet Union from his hometown and the entire United States. So the first thing I want to address with this is me reading this now, it felt more like an alternative history reading instead of a sci-fi book, which some people say sci-fi is alternative history is sci-fi. They're both kind of part of the same speculative fiction genre. But when I think of sci-fi, I personally, as a lay reader, have a vision of what I'm trying to read. And because this book took place in the 1960s, that is the setting for this book, and the 1960s is now history, it feels now like an alternative history, what would have happened if the Cold War had gotten hot, if there was a land invasion, and if the US had lost. So even though I'm not going to get too far into the is alternative history sci-fi, because I feel like that doesn't really matter. Just to me as a modern reader, I would not say this was a sci-fi book. I would say this was an alternative history book. So for 1955, when this book was written, the 1960s would have seemed very futuristic, and at the very least, this was something that was happening in the future, and it was conceivably something that hadn't happened yet, so it would be more sci-fi at that time. But where I stand now, it is now more, in my opinion, an alternative history book read. The second thing I want to comment on is I think that the author in the 1950s could rely on some of the cultural happenings around him to fuel this book. Specifically, the Soviet Union was currently existing, so fear of the Soviet Union, fear of communism in the United States, and that Cold War mentality was something the author could have drawn on to bring some fear into his books. So the fear of the Soviet Union's invading the United States, which I can't personally speak to how much of a realistic day-to-day fear that was, but at the very least there was a fear of the Cold War getting hot. That was something that citizens had to be prepared for and something that people feared. So the fact that the author could draw on his readers' fear of that, something that was a real fear, to talk about this hypothetical scenario, is something that I feel like a modern reader doesn't have. I have to put myself in the mindset of a reader in the 1950s to get that fear, because I have never lived in the same world as the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was dissolved before I was born. So even this Cold War mentality, or even one of the major players, one of the major nations in this book, hasn't existed in my lifetime. That being said, I do think the author does a good job of conveying how horrible this invasion is. I think that isn't lost. The author doesn't rely on this cultural fear too much, which I feel like would be a possibility. The author could play too much into assuming his audience has that natural fear. Instead, the author does build up some horribleness around this invasion and the sinking feeling of having lost your identity in your country to make his point. So I don't think the author relies on it too much, but I think the author did have some reliance on this current situation when writing this book. Overall, I think this was a very good read. However, I think when this was published, it was probably a great read. I think that extra added dimension of this being something that conceivably could happen in the next 20 years added that extra layer of fear, and the fact that it was more sci-fi futuristic when it was written. Well, now it reads more like an alternative history and a kind of scary what if to the average American modern reader. I think that does take it from like a great read to a good read. But because this book is almost 70 years old at this point and it's still a good read, really speaks to the author's ability to write a good book and make it interesting and make it terrifying and make it an enjoyable read 70 years later. I think that because of that, this is such a good read, and it's worth reading 70 years later. It's worth picking up. It's worth reading this alternative history piece of fiction and addressing the question of what would have happened, or what could have things been like if this scenario had played out. I think that makes it such a great read, or a good read, in the modern era, and I think that really speaks to the author's ability to keep something relevant 70 years later. A piece of futuristic fiction relevant 70 years later really speaks to the author's ability and skill and the staying power of this book. Overall, I do recommend this. As I said, I think you should pick this up. Treat this as alternative history, but it's still interesting, it's still good, and it'll still ask a lot of questions of the reader. If you have anything that you want to add in the comments below, please put it in the comments. I love to receive them. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.